Our topic today, a broad set of topics on reimagining medical progress, I think couldn't come at a more opportune time. We're living in an era when it seems like there are a lot of potential research breakthroughs. We hear about them in the news. But at the same time, some challenges with funding and support for biomedical research given tight budgets and other competing national priorities. Challenges with the cost and efficiency of research, as well as challenges with the affordability and access to some of the technologies, breakthroughs, and other new developments that research is making progress for patients. So we want to cover all of those topics today. As you heard from the introduction from Ellie, we've got a very distinguished and diverse set of perspectives to bring together on this question. And since we do have a lot of perspectives to get through, I want to try to be efficient and see if we can do two things at once with my first question for each of you, which is from the perspective that you represent, from where you sit, can you tell this group about what you see as a very promising trend or new innovation or big thing to look out for in terms of where research is headed? Want to start this on a positive note, something you see as very promising. We're going to get into the challenges as the panel goes on, but tell us a little bit about where you are and what you see, what you're most excited about given your role in this whole big research enterprise. And Gopal, I'll start with you.
Thank you, Mark. I'm pleased to be invited here to be part of this distinguished panel and to get involved in this conversation. So I'm glad you asked that question, because I think as we proceed with this conversation this morning, we need to take a look at three issues, in my opinion. First one is change. And when I talk about change, I'm talking about disruptive change. Change is the way life is all about. And it is today totally redesigning and rethinking the space we work in. What I'm alluding to is look at the last 18 months. The kind of mergers and acquisitions that have happened, we couldn't have imagined 3 to 5 years ago or 2 years ago. And we cannot forget the small and large startups, including the IBMs, the Microsofts, and the Amazons of the world. 20 years ago, when technology entered the marketplace the way it is, we know it today, it disrupted many industrial segments and sectors. We cannot lose sight of that. I'm hoping that in this conversation this morning, we will realize and recognize as to what it means to us. Second issue I believe we need to take into consideration is technology itself. There's nothing that we do in healthcare service delivery that is beyond the grasp of technology. And when I'm talking about technology, what I'm saying is that think of the new world we live in, the volume, the variety, and the velocity of data that's coming in. And this data, by the way, has new information about the patient and the individual. It changes the paradigm as to how research will be done in the future. And the third issue, I believe we cannot overlook demographic trends. If there's one way to forecast the future, it is look at the demographic changes and trends. And what I'm saying is that we have to ask ourselves how research and our work and the tools and the solutions will be delivered and how the care will be delivered to the patient, who will deliver that care, where it will be delivered, and ultimately, what are the pointers that we learn about the wellness and the health of the individual. So given all of that, we at ARC are extremely excited because what we've been doing, Mark, over the last year and a half is taking a step back and saying, let's rethink and reimagine how we at ARC can leverage our core competencies and play an even more impactful role in supporting research on health systems, practice improvement, and our data and analytics capabilities. So the grand challenge really before us is how do we see our industry through the digital lens? And I basically say to all of us that we really need to take a step back and be bold about seeing our work through the digital lens. And what that means is how are we going to redefine our own individual roles in this large, what I call the digital healthcare ecosystem. It's no more an industry as such. And we cannot see it that way because it permeates everything. Having said that, there's a lot more to talk, so I'll now listen.
Looking
Thank you.
forward to it. Great issues to tee up. Ivor?
So, first of all, Mark, thank you very much. Gopal, of course, mentioned that we are part of this distinguished panel, and I'm certainly quite pleased to be part of this August group. So, when you think about the American Heart Association, I'm privileged to serve as its president. We are recognizing that our patients are actually asking for us for something more. I began as a physician scientist doing basic research, but the American Heart Association recognizes that the realm of discovery science need to cascade both to clinical and population science and even implementation science. Research is the core of what we do. And what that therefore means is that as we begin to start thinking about when my kids ask me to come and help with jump rope for heart, we are recognizing that we need to be thinking about different new models. And so one of those new models of the American Heart Association, for example, which is second to the federal government in terms of supporting heart research and stroke research to the tune of over $4 billion. I chair the research committee. We spend close to $200 million a year supporting research. But one of the things that we're recognizing is that there are substantial headwinds to really be able to support that research. And what those headwinds mean is that we need to be engaging in new partnerships. Just to give you an example, we have one brave idea. We recognize I was at UT Southwestern Medical Center. Obviously, Brian Goldstein won the Nobel Prize for basically working out the mechanisms of cholesterol. But we're really thinking about new ways that we can begin to start intervening in cardiovascular disease at the earliest onset. So in partnership with Verily, in partnership with AstraZeneca, we were able to put out a prize totaling $75 million, recognizing that, for example, the new ways of doing research does not result in just the American Heart Association. In a complementary way, we just put out a $43 million joint partnership with the Paul Allen Institute and their Frontiers Group, where we're now moving the boundaries beyond heart disease and stroke and now begin to start thinking about brain health and cognitive impairment. And I'm privileged to be part of the panel that's going to be reviewing. And by the way, we're getting applications from all over the world. I think that that is part of the new excitement. But just as importantly, we are committed to thinking about how our patients can actually have longer and healthier lives. And what I mean by that is that as you think about the news, as you think about the incubation period for heart disease is in decades. As a medical student, I learned that, you were able to see fatty streaks when, veterans were coming back, or veterans were coming back and seeing that in the coronary artery. But when you think about brain health, what's the incubation period? That's probably for decades. So really being able to think about new ways that we can really engage young people, but more importantly, building that broader part. And the final thing that I'd like to say is that I think we have to engage all communities. And what I mean by that is that we have, I'm going to get the challenges, I think, but what I mean by that is part of my research legacy is an opportunity for our volunteers to really be able to say, you know what, I want to give an IOU. And that IOU will be that I will contribute my own health records, my own research, to be part of something that's broader than just for ourselves. And I think that really being able to expand that conversation is critically important. So I think that these are extraordinarily exciting times. We have to be able to be thinking about new models to be able to fund research. But just as well, I think that we also need to be thinking about new ways of engagement and recognizing that it needs to be more than just the traditional stakeholders.
Thank you. Mary?
Anne, yes, again, I agree. Wonderful to be here with everybody. And, I think my comments are going to be somewhat similar to the people before me in that, it's a really exciting time in both patient engagement and certainly in the use of data. And, I'm just delighted that patient engagement is a thing, certainly, and that's really credit to PCORI. And, we've engaged patients for years, but we've never called it something. It's a real thing now. And I believe very passionately that engaging patients in everything from the beginning, all the problems that we need to solve, can be solved by passionate family members who believe and are driven. And you could see this in rare diseases like cystic fibrosis, where that community rose up and basically came together and have almost cured that disease. And so we need to do that in all disease types. And I agree with what's been said before, that we have this huge opportunity to take data and to empower patients to use their data for the good of their community, to help themselves do better, help themselves live a better life, but by contributing their data to rise up the community. And I think that that's what I'm most excited about for us at the Arthritis Foundation, and certainly what I'm excited about going forward.
Thanks very much, Ann. Joe?
Okay. Thanks, thanks, Research America. I'm very happy to be here and share a perspective from PCORI. No doubt about it, the rate of appearance of new technologies, new treatments is increasing at a much faster rate than it was when PCORI got started 8 years ago. It is dramatic, and that is wonderful because there are a lot of people that need better treatments and technologies than we've got. At the same time, this does create some dilemmas and challenges for patients and some burden, both for patients and for consumers in terms of shouldering part of the costs of healthcare. And it leads to calls for understanding effectiveness and comparative effectiveness and value, particularly value, much more in greater detail, much more deeply at a patient level. And that's something that has really risen to the fore. That's something that excites me, this notion of being able to push data further in a precision, with a spirit of precision medicine, to find out what works for whom. But really, Mark, you wanted an exciting idea. I think the exciting idea I'd like to put forward is that just as the FDA and industry have over the last 10 plus years talked about regulatory science and really advanced the notion that there's a special science dedicated to getting drugs to market, I want to say that we need to think more formally than we have about a post-approval or post-regulatory science. Yes, PCORI was set up to do comparative effectiveness research, and there's no doubt that's a part of it. But I think we need something that's much more systematic, much more planful, much more collaborative between those in the pre-approval space and those in the post-approval space. And I'm talking about everyone from FDA to CMS, certainly from industry to payers. And thank you very much, Ann, for mentioning patients. I like to say that it was God's gift to PCORI to give us this name, because it's like, you find your keys under the lamppost. And our name sort of guided us to this basic truth, which eluded us for all these years. A couple other things, a couple components of a post-approval science approach for this country would include a huge concentration, as Ivor was saying, on data, and particularly on conducting research in learning health systems. And by learning health systems, I mean systems that recognize that when you don't know what you're doing, you dedicate yourself in part to collecting the data and analyzing the data for research. Some of this is going to be randomized trials. You just cannot get away from it, but we need to do randomized trials, bigger trials in real world settings. And some of this is going to be hopefully large observational studies where we watch what we're doing. The role of patients in governing this is critical. That's why we've invested a good amount of money in PCORNet, and I'm very hopeful that PCORNet going forward will be a part of the solution. There are certainly many other networks, many other sources of real-world data. There aren't nearly enough, in my view. One of the problems is there are not enough scientists, and I'm really happy to say that together with ARC and under Gopal's leadership, we are just on the verge of announcing the first round of training programs for scientists based in learning health systems. So the science of doing work in learning health systems needs some development, and we're going to have, I think it's 6 centers, yes. 6 centers with multiple trainees per site. Those are the main things. I think just to say in closing that having patients at the center has proven to be not only a driver of making research more relevant and effective, but also in most people's description, more enjoyable and meaningful. So second what Ann said, and thanks again.
Thank you. Tim?
Great. Well, I also want to say it's an amazing privilege to be up here. I also want to say hi, Mom, because she's back in California wondering what I'm doing up here. If you ask me what the most exciting thing is, it distills down to two things for me. One is the emergence of the capability to predict things. The other is the emergence of far greater willingness to collaborate. If you look at prediction in science, and I confess, I'm a computer scientist by training, so I fell into life science 21 years ago and have been unbelievably privileged to stay in that industry for the last 21 years. The ability to predict scientific outcomes, E.J. Corey, before he won the Nobel Prize, was publishing that in the late 60s and early 70s. You have somebody like Moncef Slaoui, who's the head of research at GSK, making his formal statement that we will always predict. As pharma, we will always fail, but we can't fail for reasons that we could have predicted. If you look at the onset of things like Watson, and of course Watson's just one, the promise of being able to utilize the data at hand to predict an outcome is more and more likely. And not only that, it's changing fundamentally what pharmaceutical research looks like. You have companies like Benevolent in the UK that are bypassing traditional research and traditional bench research and simply gathering as much data as possible and doing it all computationally. This is an entire paradigm, and they're certainly not the only one. Exscientia, how good are these guys? Their former head of AI was just picked up by Facebook, right? So, I mean, you can think what you want about Facebook, but they paid a pretty penny for him. Right? This will fundamentally change when these guys identify a candidate that has then been picked up and gone through the phases to a therapy. This will change pharma as we know it, right? More and more will be done, and this is across all the landscape of pharma. You see the emergence of companies like Verge Genomics, which was profiled in Forbes. What is it? It's just 20 smart kids knowing how to use the computers and knowing how to use the data to predict, not to analyze. Analyze is from my generation. Analyze and takes the next step. To predict an outcome, to write what we call AI, to not be afraid to use machine learning. This is something that by the time my grandchildren are grown up, there'll be therapies that have been brought to market for this through this mechanism. I think that that's fantastic. And the other thing that I'm more and more attuned to is the willingness to collaborate. The willingness to collaborate breaks down the barriers between companies doing fundamental research in the same area. And this was one of the things that I really appreciated from last year's Research America when we talked about the opioid crisis and what are pharmas going to do to bring in new therapies that aren't addictive. You know, the days of 50 pharma doing 50 things in isolation are gone. First of all, because most of the pharma's consolidated quite a bit. So there is that. But the willingness to collaborate openly and share the data. We hear the data, it's a common theme amongst everyone here, right? Precision medicine, how we can access that data. There's challenges around GDPR and the utilization capabilities of that data. But more and more we see a pre-collaborative belief that making this data shared and the societal responsibility to get a therapy to market, to not worry that this is my data. If I'm not looking at, a rare disease like alkaptonuria, I'll share this data to see if somebody else can use this that is working in that space. To me, those are incredibly, incredibly innovative and exciting emergences in the last, at least that I've seen in the last 10 years.
Great, thanks, Tim. Sounds very positive. Greg?
First, thank you, Mary, for having us, or as I call you, Topical Storm Mary. You cover a lot of territory, and I look forward to your newsletters every week. They're terrific. I think the biggest tool for changing medicine is the big idea. And there are a couple of new ideas that a lot of us are always kind of shocked are new ideas. As an example, now we're going to start using real-world evidence. What were we using? Seriously, what were we using? nobody lives in a clinical trial type population, right? We live in the real world, but yet we're just now starting to use real world evidence. That's a crazy idea, but it's coming into vogue. Most people don't know and don't believe that we use placebos in cancer clinical trials. And yet they probably were surprised last week when the FDA put out rules about when you should use placebos in clinical trials in cancer. So we have a lot of gaps between what people think is going on and what's going on. There are also some old ideas that we need to bring to the forefront. You know, Plato, way back, created these so-called Platonic ideas of, you know, the virtues. And they're not things you see in the real world, but they live in your mind. Like the picture of a pyramid in your mind doesn't actually exist in the real world because every pyramid's different. But if I say, think of a cube, you all can think of a cube. If I were to say to you, what should a health system look like that treats people well, where people share data, where we have standards, where we have diversity of access and equality of access, you all understand what I'm talking about, but you don't see it in the real world. So when I'm asked by people, which is an aphorism for my mother, who's 95 and has always struggled to understand what I do, especially when I was a consultant. What is the Biden Cancer Initiative trying to do? I say, well, Mom, we're trying to get people to share data. She said, you mean they don't share data? I said, we're trying to get standards for assays, for they don't have standards. We're trying to get people the same kind of care in Memphis that they can get in New York City. You mean they, and since I'm from Arkansas, that's important. She said, you mean they don't tell people in Memphis what they're doing in New York? I said, Mom, let me boil this down. We're trying to create the system you think we already have, right? And that is, to me, the challenge of all the tools is how do we use all of these AI and electronic medical records and cellular therapies, all of these things in pursuit of what we all think is the right system to treat people well and fairly and help them avoid lack of quality of life or early death from, in our case, cancer. Now, the comment about, patients want to share their data. This is true, and the disruption that's going to happen is going to happen from the bottom up. It's not going to happen at Hopkins or Sloan Kettering or Dana-Farber. It's going to happen from the bottom up. When Uber and Lyft and Airbnb made all these technologies available to people to disrupt those markets, the companies didn't disrupt those markets. The people disrupted those markets using a tool that was a new idea. So when we talk about patients wanting to share their data, here's a new idea. Patients should be able to require their doctor and the hospital and the research institution to share their data.
Amen.
It shouldn't be a request. It should be a mandate. You're going to share my data, and here are the people I want to share it with. We have got to move from it would be nice if we give patients access to their data to it's a requirement, not only that they get access to their data, which, by the way, is already a requirement, but that they have the ability and the legal ability to require their care providers to join the system. Because the All-Star game was in Washington this year, which was probably a jinx because it was the highlight of the season. And actually, it was the home run derby that was the highlight of the season. All these great players show up. They keep the uniform from their from their team, and they show up in one game, and then they go back and play on their team. Well, think about ASCO and AACR and the big conferences. Those are all-star games. Problem is, when people go back, they're not on a team. They go back and they're not wearing a team uniform. They only show up for the all-star game because we've trained people to think it's all about individual achievement, when in fact it's an enterprise, and we need to think of it that way. And that is an idea that is finally taking hold that will transform healthcare if we realize we're all in it together.
Thank you, Greg. Miguel?
Well, I'll try to follow Greg's passion. Oh, that was great. Well, it's a pleasure to be here. I may try to echo all of the statements that were made, but in the context of where I come from. So I work in UCB Pharma. We're mid-level pharma, and my role is actually to identify technologies at the early stage to help us develop new medicines. So I'll look at things like microbiome, genome editing, all the way to data. And to answer your question, well, I do think data is what excites me, and simply because we can edit the genome, we can maybe look at your gut and see what flora is there, and we can, but if we do all of that, it's kind of building all these ships to navigate and discover new lands, but then not knowing where to go. And if we can't use data to really understand the patient, understand what are we measuring, and does that matter to the patient, then when we get, what will likely happen is we'll swim, swim, swim and die at the shore. And we don't want to do that. So UCB has restructured itself in terms of patient value, but that has many facets to it. But coming back to discovering medicines, if you know what aspect that you're treating in the patient facilitates you discovering the molecular mechanisms that then allows it from the cell all the way up to the patient to develop the right medicine. And I think data will provide that. It's not going to be a panacea for all diseases. It's not going to be a success for all because, for example, if you're a patient with very rare disease, you're not going to have electronic medical records because the health system doesn't see you. So but wearables and other things may come and fill in that gap. But I do think that understanding the patient better in what we measure will allow us to then find the right molecular mechanisms and then come back and deliver the right value. So to me, data is very exciting. And also because it will change us how we look at the problem. All of these advances are coming online, but we still look at the problem like we did in the 20th century. So we have to look at the data in an unbiased way, really understand, oh, the patients are like this. And talk about some of the things. I do think there are also minor changes in that actually have a big impact. The way I found out my son had severe food allergies was by giving him peanut butter, and that resulted in having the police department, the fire department, and the ambulance show up in my lawn and the whole drama that came with that. As I show up in the ER, the attending physician says, well, does he have asthma? I said, yes. Does he have eczema? I said, yes. Well, these things come in 3. And I'm like, well, okay, then why didn't the pediatrician order a food shot? And by the way, the only way you know someone's allergic is by giving them the food. On the flip side of that, I was also talking to some scientists at the Montefiore Hospital that were able to get all of the electronic medical records into a big graph. And I won't get technical, but I asked them, well, can you predict what's the odds ratio if someone shows up with this to then develop food allergies? And he said, well, we can calculate that's pretty high. So then just changing the standard of care by saying, maybe it would have been better that now that the odds ratio of them developing food, we would have done that at the physician's office and spare me the whole theatrics and drama that has it, which aside from it has a huge psychological impact on the parents and child. But from there, then to also understanding, we have a collaboration with Harvard, Zach Lohani, and he has a nice paper showing the different types of autistic children. If you look at time and the different phenotypic presentations they have. Well, if we're trying to do a cognition trial in an autism patient that also has IBD, it may confound your results in the cognition trial. So just to sum it up, I do think because data will allow us to see the patient in its totalities, the issues, may allow us to redefine what we measure so that then we sail the ships to the right place and not die at the shore. Okay, so I think that's how I see the problem.
Thanks, Miguel. You all have come at this from very different perspectives, but actually I hear all along the panel a pretty consistent vision of what research ought to look like. It should be much more digitally based. It should be much more, the data should be much more liquid, using consistent standards and interoperability. It should support tying back to basic research issues and study design, the kinds of insights that Miguel was describing and Tim and others around being able to use big data to see patterns, help guide the design of clinical studies and help implement them at a lower cost. It should be able to bring down the cost of clinical trials to get new promising products to a point where the confidence about their safety and effectiveness and more precise patient populations is well understood when they go on the market, but then it should recognize that there is a whole lot more to learn in actual medical practice, as Joe was emphasizing, not just about the safety and effectiveness of a treatment, but its comparative effectiveness, its cost effectiveness, its value. But to paraphrase Greg's conversation with his mom, it doesn't seem like we're there yet. And in fact, it seems like if you look at the cost of clinical trials today, some of the challenges in bringing very promising ideas from early stages actually into medical practice and then using them with this kind of learning healthcare system support behind it, we're a long way from that. And I don't want to go down the row again, but I do want to challenge this group a little bit and challenge everybody here that you've got an audience that cares deeply about these issues. Why aren't we making more progress towards this idealized vision? What could help accelerate progress? Dan, go ahead.
I mean, I think that simplistically, it's just going to sound, what's good about our country is the problem. And that is that everyone's out to make money, to be creative, to monetize data, to you. And so in many ways, that's the enemy of collaboration. And if you look at really our healthcare system, it's the same thing. Many players there are trying to do the right thing to solve it, but it's impacting each other's business, and we just don't sit down. And so, collaboration, meaningful collaboration, is sort of anti-American. It's because we're all out to make a buck. So I really see that as that we have to look at incentivizing collaboration in a different way.
Some collaborative business models? Does it? You were talking about a lot of consolidation and new business arrangements taking place. Could that help accelerate progress? Do you see any promising trends to address Anne's concern that siloed approaches to business models don't seem very compatible with the vision that you all laid out?
And you do see a lot. There's organizations. I'm part of one from Pharma with Pistoia, where again, the idea is to bring together collaborative efforts to share the data. We silo competitive data, but we try as much as possible to expand the boundaries of pre-competitive. What is pre-competitive data? I would add one other maybe concern, and that's the concern. So Greg talked about the utilization of an individual's data to basically lead to the greater good. And at the same time, I'm not judging one way or another, but there's almost a hysteria globally around data privacy. So you say, well, let's have the individual state that our data can be used. That's great. I'm all for that. Then you say, and stipulate who can use it. How on earth are we going to educate the world's population on who is good and who is not? And this is one of the challenges with GDPR with EMA is, I can change this and I can change my mind tomorrow. How much incentive is there for somebody to consume this data and use it if the high cost of having to review this data on a daily basis, Fred changed their mind and doesn't want us to use it anymore, purge it from the system, purge what we learned from it. Good luck. Pharma is a risk-averse business because of the internal or the inherent risk in the business anyway. So I think the whole idea around data privacy, we're so worried about it, and Facebook losing it and Amazon losing it. How is that going to help us with the individual changing their mind and making their most personal data available? I think that's tough.
Yeah, Greg and then Joe.
So I think Alan Leshner's here somewhere. He was on a group we had at Faster Cures in 2006 or 7 with Merle Weinberg and Ed Benz and a few others, David Baltimore, Gail Castle, around how should we change the intramural program at the NIH, which is $3 billion a year then, to be a model for innovation instead of another university campus. And I said pejoratively a Division II or III university campus. So the challenge is, The challenge is we have to have models that people can imitate that show how we can share data, how we can have standards, how we can have new kinds of collaborative clinical trials and adaptive clinical trials. But if we keep giving money in the same way to the same people, we're not going to change anything. Now, nobody's done a better job than Research America in helping support the NIH budget. And they've always been very upfront that we also have to have the culture expand, not just the budget. And that's why I'm still passionate that if we want new models for all of these things, and PCORI does a great job here too, we've got to show people what it looks like. And we've got a place where it could be the crown jewel of innovation. To have the NIH intramural campus be a place where you come for 2 or 3 years like DARPA, you do something wonderful, whether it's around immunotherapy assays, et cetera. But when you think who's doing innovative work, like the Parker Institute and others, they don't set it up like NIH. And that's not good. We want NIH to be the flagship, and right now they're not on the intramural side. And I think that could be a great laboratory, so to speak, for all the new ideas that so many people have about how to do research, how to do trials, how to deal with patient issues, genomics, survivorship, all of these things.
Joe, new funding models and new business models to make this approach work. You're thinking a lot about that.
I
right?
want to talk about the other campuses in the country, aside from the NIH, because I think there's change that needs to happen there. Most of them actually are health systems, delivery systems, as well as schools. From our experience with PCORNet, you're still bringing two completely different ideas. PCORNet is an idea that researchers will come together irregardless of where they are and collaborate, find ways to share data in partnership with patients, and do things that you can't do on a single campus. Do 20,000 person trials in a year. Put together 50,000 people who've had a particular surgical procedure and learn what works for whom. But the rewards of the investigators in those systems who are part of PCORNet, the rewards back home are not highly aligned with doing what Rob Califf likes to call other people's research. So sometimes this is research. It's not a single other person's research. It's research in many cases that has welled up that we need this done. But if it's not my R01, I'm not going to get as much credit as the girl down the hall who got the R01. So,
so what's the better model for that?
Pardon me?
Is there a way for PCORI is putting together,
well,
PCORNet has put together collaborative funding models where different centers can get a piece of the funding for research that's on a topic that they collectively care about. Do we need to do more of that? How do we get the investigators to have more credit for those kinds of approaches?
It's a great question, and it's a big challenge. I will only point to one thing that I think might start working in our favor, which is that as these health systems that back up the universities more and more begin to bear risk for the costs of care to their patients and for delivering care to populations, I think it will change their perspective. It will increase the value that they will place on this kind of research. They'll understand that not everything can be figured out here, on my campus, that we do need to collaborate. And that, by golly, the researchers that are doing that kind of research are brilliant, and we need them, and they need the reward. It's a slightly different model than the inspired.
It's a different model for supporting research faculty. So Miguel and Ivor, you had a comment, and then I would like to Gopal to get your take on what some of the implications are for ARC's funding and ARC's support. Yeah.
I don't know how to shape, but I do think it's about that we're greater than the sum of our parts. And if you really think about that, well, if I collaborate with you and you do this and I do that, we can create a lot more. And because we're a med-level pharma, we can't do everything ourselves. So we do find a lot of opportunity to say, okay, this academic lab brings this to the table, and we can bring our platforms to the table. And from there, we can create value that otherwise wouldn't exist. And I think, it doesn't work. I'm not saying it's perfect, but I think that's part of the idea that we can create a lot more value beyond just our individual research. And for example, we have platforms that, yes, we use for our programs and for our products, but we know there's value left on the table for areas that we don't work on. So then we try to find, hey, if we gave you our antibody platform and so on, maybe you can create value and we both share on that success. And I do think we, and particularly with the data space, which is a little bit more embryonic, but for other things is thinking that there's a lot, we're leaving a lot of value on the table because we're not coming together. And I do think that exploring those opportunities of saying, I bring A, you bring B, and we get all the way to Z much faster. So I think that's, it's a cultural thing though, right?
Yeah, the pressure to change the culture seems to be growing. Ivor?
I'm going to pick up on what Miguel, but sort of give a sort of slightly different value set, just to sort of, for us to establish a couple of baselines. So on this panel, you have individuals who represent cancer, cardiovascular disease, and let's say arthritis, et cetera, et cetera. But if you were to just ask yourself, and some of us in the audience perhaps, you know, have our own family members who became trained in those areas, let alone to become a physician scientist, let alone to get your first R01. That happens at age 42. Yamamoto is in the audience. I mean, it is even north of that for other people. But who are the disruptors for the Facebook and the Google and the Ubers? They're in their early 30s. If you want to get the Nobel Prize in mathematics, you probably figured out the formula in your 20s. But the amount of training for you to really be able to not only do the practice part, but to then be in the science space is a long time. So at the American Heart Association, we recognize that we really need to be bringing new innovators into the entire equation. And so as we're thinking about the American Heart Association Institute for Precision Cardiovascular Medicine, we think that we've got to be able to bring in the mathematicians, the data scientists. We got to be able to be catalysts providing them grants. So in collaboration, for example, with Amazon Web Services, we're able to provide access to the platforms for the data, but recognize that we need new partners so that you can then be able to have the kind of new teams that can really be able to tackle the kinds of questions. And I think that we've got to really be able to think about solutions in a much more innovative way. It doesn't necessarily have to be the R01 grants. We have to be thinking about new ways for us to really be able to identify those individuals who still to be able to, the microbiome is the ultimate big data problem. Right. So just to sort of put that in a little bit more perspective, that we need all comers. And quite frankly, medical, how much can you really be au fait with the nuances of clinical care and still then to be at the leading edge of being able to ask that question? So I think we've got to open up our lens, and we have to be able to think about redefining our curricula, as well as, of course, really being able to provide incentives, back to your point, and in order for us to really be able to think about the collaborative solutions for the future.
Now, Gopal, you started out this panel by talking about disruption in many other industries, but coming to healthcare too, and we've now had some pretty extensive discussion about some barriers to disruption in biomedical research and how they might be overcome. This seems in line with some of your thinking, and are there some changes at ARC that go along with what we've heard today, or ideas that could help?
Mark, I'm glad you asked that question, because disruptions are a way of life. We've got to accept them. The question now before us is, how do we strategize solutions to overcome those objections or disruption, barriers to disruption? So let me talk about three things that we are looking to do at ARC. First, we are focusing our attention on the patient, because patient's voice needs to be heard. And changing the paradigm, instead of thinking of research first, start with the patient first. What does that mean? Last month, we organized and announced an app challenge, basically where we said, and thanks to the partnerships here, including working with PCORI, is to PCOR Trust Fund, is to basically capture the patient-reported outcomes data and saying, can we develop apps that allow the patient to interact more closely and give their viewpoint of how health is being, how they feel about their health, how they feel about the services they have received. Research community will have new forms of data they do not have available today to better understand the patient's perspective. We're also going out there and talking to the delivery systems, to the C-suite, because they have very different needs for data. What they are saying to us is, we cannot wait for 5 years, 6 years to get the research findings, to use them and apply them. What they're saying is that they need rapid research life cycle, 6 months at best, maybe 18 months. They cannot wait too long. That changes the paradigm for the research community to think differently. What they're also saying is that whatever the findings are, they should come out in tool forms that are digital so that they can be incorporated and operationalized, which is a very different model from just dissemination and implementation. The last mile is the findings and tools getting operationalized. Unless that happens, innovation will not happen. And they have to be integrated with the current health IT system. So the research community has to take a step back and say, who are the customers? Of course, we recognize that the patients are important, but equally important are the members of the C-suite, the delivery systems. I'm not sure we totally understand and leverage that opportunity to redefine. The third piece that we are looking at ARC is saying, let's have a discussion about what HSR needs to be in the future. Is it just healthcare service research, or is it healthcare systems delivery research and practice? We need to change that paradigm completely, which means we have to think differently in the research community as well. Where we are thinking is at ARC, how can we be the catalyst for that change when it comes to learning health systems, or even rethinking the use of data, because the research community has been focused for the last 20 years, and rightly so, on the healthcare data. But we have data coming from all sorts of sources about other determinants. How will we think in terms of transdisciplinary research? Is that the new frontier? How are we going to engage social scientists in the research initiatives, maybe even informatics, even people from the business school? Because if the C-suite is saying we want to focus on lean and business process re-engineering, we in the research community have to recognize that new reality and rethink our work as well. So having said that, I think we at ARC are really excited about how we are positioning and how we want to change. And that all depends upon the input from the research community. We'll be rolling out some roundtable discussions over the next few months. We have a few more challenges that will be announced over the next 6 months. And we have already started this conversation at ARM meeting earlier this year in summer. We organized and had C-suite come in and participate into a discussion with the research community to figure out what is the new frontier of research. We cannot overlook that reality as well.
Great discussion. We're going to open this up to questions and brief comments from all of you in just a minute, so be thinking about it. I did want to come back to the role of the patient in all of this. So you all have done a great job of laying out new directions that federally funded research projects can go, whether PCORI, ARC, NIH, new directions for leadership of academic health centers involved in research and how they encourage the development of their faculty in a way that's consistent with these fundamental trends in higher value clinical research and learning healthcare system. But we're not in, Greg, I think you talked about change coming from disruptive consumers. And given all of this infrastructure, all of the scientific knowledge, expertise, it hasn't been quite so simple yet as, pull out your app and, okay, I'll sign up for this learning healthcare system with all my data shared smoothly so I can get really personalized guidance. And also patients like me who I want to support for the future can get better evidence to guide their own decisions as well. We're not at that app yet. Are there, from the standpoint of the number of patient groups here too, who are trying to push for the same kind of direction? Quick thoughts. We only have like 5 minutes for this round. What could help accelerate, make patients more effective forces for change to complement the system changes, the leadership, C-suite changes that you all have been talking about?
I think that someone down here said it, that, the change will have to come because of a passionate patient voice, consumers demanding change. And we've talked here a couple times about living learning health systems, and one of the things that the Arthritis Foundation is doing is using patient insights, not necessarily data, so we don't have all those, around some measures that we know are important to patients and align with the Promise 10 data. And we're beginning to serve that up to patients individually as a measurement and then in comparison to their community or to the arthritis community as a whole. And that will drive people to see, well, I'm not doing as well, or Chicago's not doing as well as Washington, and why is that? And engaging then patient experts, so to speak, in changing the dynamic. And so that really begins to create this groundswell, this movement of, I have the power to move things forward. I think the other thing too that we have to really think about is that patient empowerment is also such a good thing in dealing with the mental health issues that this country faces, and that it's, mental health is a big problem, and when families can get engaged and make a difference and do something, that's empowering. That really deals with some of those other issues that are hanging out there.
Well, I just want to.
So, yeah, quick comments. I know this is a hard, important topic, but I
So
want to get to more.
a lesson from PCORnet was we tried to take patient-powered research networks, which are organizations of patients governed by patients and interested in participating in research. And we tried using methods like Blue Button to get them to get their electronic health record data and put it into the same kind of format as the clinical data research networks. That did not work out that well because, as for the reasons we've said, you really can't get your data. But I do believe that there's more to be learned from patient organizations, probably sponsored by advocacy organizations in the first place, but patients organized to influence research and at the same time to participate in research.
And bring all of their collective data to bear to back that up. Yeah.
Atul Gawande, in Being Mortal, said, we don't ask patients, how do you want to live your life? Especially at the end of life. The system has never asked that question. We need to start there. How do you want to live your life? What's important to you? And then we need to storm the gates. That information needs to be available without you having to go see a doctor who you immediately feel like you're inferior to, and have the doctor tell you how you're going to live your life, because that's what the doctor is trained to do. We're going to do this surgery. Well, do I really need the surgery? Well, this is what we do. That's not acceptable. So starting with how do patients want to live their life, and then giving them information. You might say, well, doesn't WebMD do that? It's like shopping at Costco when you go to WebMD. It's like overwhelming. It's not patient-focused. It's everything else focused. So we need the patient's goals and the patient's voice so that they can design their own. And we say, well, people don't think about their health till they have to. None of us think about anything until we have to. You don't think about Uber till you need a car. You don't think about Airbnb till you need a room. You don't think about your money until there's a crash. We all have that problem. But when you do want to ask, what about my health, it should be so much simpler to get the answer.
I think that's the point I was going to make as well. It's less about empowerment and more about benefit. Right? I mean, at the point that you're looking at it, what is my benefit to do this? What am I getting? This is why I also second the idea that advocacy groups are critical, right? I follow the American Heart Association because I have multiple stents. I have a vested interest in this. And the more we can capitalize on that and focus, I mean, we talk all the time at my organization about user experience, right? Some silly marketing phrases like delighting people. But at the end of the day, it's meeting and showing, demonstrating benefit. And if you get the individual to do that, that's when you'll get the upswell. Is sadly, like you said, companies want to make a buck. People want to see what is in it for me specifically. I'd love it to be more
organizations and tools that can bring those
Sure.
patients together. That seems like a
and that's the
potential,
harmonization,
business
as you
model
were saying
too.
on the disruptive side. This is where we bring in technologists, where we bring in the kids from Harvard and Stanford and all of the other schools that I'm obviously missing. But let them take a stab at being familiar enough with getting an Uber on everybody's iPhone. Let's get this on everybody's
Miguel,
iPhone.
Ivor, any final quick comments on this? I want to open up to the group.
When we say patients as consumers, I don't, we should look, patients are, and knowing their issues and being able to address that is what we should focus on. However, if we are going to say they're consumers, we know very well, given what you said about people being able to understand the value of sharing their medical records or understanding the value of contributor advocacy. The amount of effort that's required for a patient to find out about their condition is enormous. Yet, after I typed vacation search on my browser, very rapidly I get an advertisement for a vacation I can't afford, or something I can't. Why? So we know very well how to treat consumers. However, that bridge to patients has not been. It's a different type of consumer, and it should be the same. I should know what clinical trials are available when I shouldn't be asking people, or know someone that works in pharma that can help me out. These techniques and micro-marketing and neuromarketing and all of this are very well known. And what we don't do is decrease the change that's required in effort for patients to be able to participate and get the information they have. So I think if we are going to say consumers, I think that's something that we could leverage to make their lives better. Thanks.
Just a quick comment.
Just a quick comment. Patients, like communities, are not created equally. We have health disparities. And just the point to make that, sometimes the message is just as important as the messenger having to deliver that message.
Thank you. I would like to open up this discussion about the future of the medical research enterprise, reimagining it to all of you. So if you have a question or comment, I think you can raise your hand. We have microphones around. Yes, right here. And then Herb up here next. Yeah, go ahead. And let us know who you are when you ask your question.
Is the microphone on, or do I need to push a button?
You're good.
There you go. Okay, great. I'm Sue Curry, provost at the University of Iowa. Not speaking on behalf of, but my other job is chairing the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force. And this is a fabulous conversation. I want to start by saying I think we need to look very broadly at the health sciences when we're talking about this, not just at medicine. One marker. Second is I'd like to see two sectors represented on a future panel, social media and academia. And then my third is just an idea for a learning laboratory that already exists, and those are the clinical and translational science institutes. I think these are places where, and I'm sorry I lost my notes and I want to do this quickly, but I think that this might be an opportunity to create for engagement, which is what we're talking about. And it's not just patients, it's public engagement. What they have done around the clinical trial enterprise. So we have REDCap, we have an IT platform that enables better clinical trials. We need an IT platform that enables better engagement. I have the proposal written to my own institution, which killed it by 1,000 questions, but I think it's not unusual for academia. But I think that there are some great opportunities to get the kinds of input that we need in terms of what kind of data do we want, how do we create and sustain engagement that welcomes patient advocacy but goes beyond that.
Yeah, great points. Investments, it's really a public good. Investments in these platforms that make it easier to do all the things that you all are talking about. And just in the interest of time, I know, brief answer. I know you're doing a lot of you are doing a lot.
I just want to say one thing about the notion of data other than medicine. I think even medicine has finally gotten the message that there's a lot of data from sources outside of clinical care and a lot of facts from outside clinical encounters that influence health. So even medicine gets that now.
All right. Her part is Columbia and Cornell. I first want to applaud the comments and discussion. Great. And I couldn't be more enthusiastic than you guys are about collaboration, breaking down silos, etc. But let me ask you a question. There are many individuals, and I can cite specifics, who, by virtue of the passion and drive, whatever made them feel they were going to do something about a given area of healthcare or medicine, who've accomplished great deals. How much of a problem is it if one tries to forge that individual passion with a necessity for group involvement?
I missed the very end of your statement.
In other words, how do you blend both the value that comes out of collaboration with the value that comes out with individuals with passion to solve a healthcare problem?
I really think people can get very passionate about solving healthcare problems, and that if we can raise our scientists with that as an ideal and point to heroes in those areas, I really think you can take the geniuses and get them to think of these questions as serious questions, which is not to say that the geniuses our academic institutions have nurtured for generations haven't made major contributions and won't need to. But I do think you can excite those people about these questions, although for some reason these questions have been kind of seen as the dreg and the drudgery up to this point. That's what needs to change.
Yeah. Greg and Miguel.
Whenever I get emails of people who need help with cancer, what I see is the patient gets diagnosed and immediately a support team forms around that patient. Not just their doctor, but a caregiver, a family member, another doctor they may know as a family friend. So they get a passionate team around them immediately. What I've learned from the Biden Cancer Initiative's interaction with a lot of different disciplines is that we have had no problem getting people to engage passionately as teams from different institutions if we really give them a platform and a mission where they think we will help them actually solve the problem. Whether it's data standards or data sharing or pediatric clinical trials, when we started talking to people about a new model of promoting pediatric clinical trials, we were overwhelmed with people who wanted to devote the rest of their career to that problem. So I'm very optimistic that this is happening. I just wish we had more of it, but it's definitely happening.
Miguel, I'm trying to get in one more question.
Is that more of a problem of the incentives? Because France lifted the World Cup as a team, yet there were individuals in that team that had moments of genius. A Super Bowl championship is won by a team in which some individuals throughout the game or throughout the season had moments of genius. And I don't think you can be a genius all the time. And when you make a drug touches thousands of people, from the academia through the research to people who are figuring out how to compact a pill to a powder, how it's all the way to the clinical trials and how it's marketed. So I think it has to do more with the incentives and the idea that one person can drive. At certain moments, yes, and other moments, no. But it goes back to what I was saying before, is you have to see it as at one point your genius, the other point his genius, and the sum of that's going to be much greater. And if we have this notion that it's only one individual that can care, I think it's much more of a team sport than an individual sport. And if we see it as an individual sport, I don't think we're going to get anywhere.
We'll see if it can switch. Great discussion. Quick question, and then we're going to have to wrap up. Yeah, I know. I wish we had more time.
John Fontaine, cardiologist, Philadelphia, also president of the Association of Black Cardiologists. Now, we've talked about technological advancements. We talked about new models. We talked about transdisciplinary activities, AI. All of these are high-level, high-tech components of the research endeavors. We also know that minorities are underrepresented in research. And the issue with the development of precision medicine now, its advancement is also starting to omit or exclude, not intentionally, minorities. NIH has spent millions and millions of dollars, tens of millions of dollars, on trying to get minority participation in research, and it's not really been very successful, I must say. I think you might agree with that. So we talk about new models. What new models can we incorporate and, as was mentioned, operationalize to include the increasing, changing demographic and minority populations in this country? How do we engage them? How do we operationalize all these wonderful thoughts that you guys have been talking about?
Not just in the research, but in the real world.
And in the healthcare delivery as well, yes.
Systems. Yeah, it got to be a quick answer.
Organize. It's all about going to where people are, talking to the people they talk to, whether it's the minister, whether it's the pharmacist, whether it's the grandmother in the church. When we're politically organizing, that's what we do. When companies are marketing to those communities, that's what they do. So as a health system, we keep saying, well, people don't show up. Well, that's not an excuse. It's like diversity. Well, no African Americans showed up for the panel, so we didn't put anybody on the panel. That's never an excuse. You have to go where people are and make the resources available to their community clinic that are the same ones available at Columbia or Sloan Kettering or Dana-Farber. We are working with a number of people on our board and advisory committee who do outreach to sequence people with cancer in communities that never see a doctor. And here in Washington, people took vans to Anacostia to check children's teeth because tooth decay was the cause of most absenteeism in school in Washington, D.C. But you have to go where the people are and quit putting the burden on them to come to you. That just never works. And in speaking of the problem, in 2 weeks, I'm on a panel organized in New York by the Organization of African First Ladies to talk about breast cancer and cervical cancer in Africa. You talk about a challenge when people spend a year talking to their minister instead of seeing a doctor when they find a lump. By the time they get to the doctor, it's too late. And this is a huge issue. It just blows my mind of how we reach different populations with everything we know to save them if we've never gone to them and find out why they do what they do.
It is hard to see how we're going to solve these problems and address disparities unless we take these learning health systems, the approaches that you have talked about, right out to these communities that really need help. Wish we had more time to discuss this, but this a big theme has been new kinds of disruptive collaborations. You all have collaborated. We did not plan this ahead of time, but it seems like some very consistent themes here. You've collaborated in doing the panel. I want to thank you for that, but I also want to thank everybody here. As you heard from this panel, there are lots of steps that you can take now to help advance this transformational view of medical research. And I'm glad to have Research America supporting this effort. Thank you all very much.